There is only one real problem in the world, and it doesn't matter whether the desired accomplishment is managing a sports team, building a business, or running an empire. The problem is the same: leadership. Because of the tremendous consequences involved and outcomes that affect the lives of so many, the importance of leadership is immutable through the ages and highly relevant into the future. Welcome to the Leadership Lyceum, a CEO's virtual mentor. Now, here's your host, Tom Lindquist.
You've entered the Leadership Lyceum. We'll bring you direct access to top CEOs and directors of boards in an interview format that provides insight on situational issues that confront CEOs every day. Think of it as a CEO's virtual mentor. Coming up next in the Leadership Lyceum, what's it like going from CFO to CEO by joining a company controlled by Carl Icahn? We'll sit down with Mark Pytosh, CEO of CVR Partners, a Houston-based publicly traded master limited partnership that owns fertilizer processing facilities. It's controlled by Carl Icahn, Icahn Enterprises. As part of our series on the subject of CEO from CFO, I met with Mark Pytosh in his Houston offices earlier this year. Mark is unique in the series as CEO of a publicly traded master limited partnership. CVR Partners is a $300 million revenue manufacturer of ammonia and urea ammonium nitrate for fertilizer products. CVR Partners is 53% owned by CVR Energy. CVR Energy engages in petroleum refining through two crude oil refineries, one in Oklahoma and one in Kansas. And of particular note, CVR Energy is controlled by Carl Icahn's Icahn Enterprises. A little on Mark. Mark grew up in the Chicagoland area. He attended the University of Illinois in Champaign and graduated with a BS in chemistry in 1986, and interestingly, right after that joined Kidder Peabody in their equity research area. After 3 years, he moved into the investment banking side of Kidder Peabody. He moved upward as a managing director with DLJ and then to Lehman Brothers, focused broadly on industrials and specifically on the automotive industry. And then after 18 years in investment banking, he moved into corporate leadership as CFO of Waste Services, which is a $500 million publicly traded solid waste company with several PE firms among its public ownership. He went to Covanta after that as CFO. Covanta is a $1.8 billion New York Stock Exchange-listed waste-to-energy renewable power company. And of note here was that Sam Zell was chairman of the board. In that role, Mark executed a $1.8 billion recapitalization of the company. He then moved to Tervita, a $5 billion energy services company in Calgary as CFO in 2010. The company had been taken private 3 years before his arrival through an LBO, and he led another recapitalization there of about $2.5 billion in the debt structure. We'll pick up now on our interview in Mark's Houston office as he moved into CVR Partners in 2014. In 2014, you joined CVR Partners here as CEO. And in the wake of, I think, Carl Icahn's investment in CVR Energy, there's so many situations that you've been through with different ownership and different involvement of notable individuals in your career as both CFO and now CEO. And it was our meeting about a month and a half ago that really inspired this series of CEO from CFO. I thought we'd start with the present, moving from CFO to CEO here. It's one challenge just to make that transition. I can only imagine how challenging that would be in an Icahn-controlled enterprise. What is that like?
It was not a dramatic transition working for the Icahn organization as compared to working for private equity firms or for Sam Zell, because they're all relatively intense owners that looked at how the business performed, what was the strategic thrust of the company, and where was it headed. So it wasn't really vastly different. And in some ways, as compared to my experiences in Calgary, where we had a handful of private equity firms that owned that company, so effectively a number of different opinions about what the company should do or steps that should be taken. The Icahn group is a very focused, intense group, but speaking with one voice makes it much easier. So I've actually in some ways found it with the same level of intensity, but easier speaking to a group with one voice. I found the Calgary situation to be more difficult because the group, there were differences of opinion, and no one controlled the company, so everyone's voice counted, and so that made it difficult. So every decision that was made, some people, some of the owners agreed with it, some owners disagreed. With the Icahn group, you're really dealing with one party. They're very intensely focused on the management team and their ability to stay focused, allocating capital properly, running the business, low cost, but nothing really different than I think I've seen over time, but maybe with a higher degree of intensity than before. Carl owns the company, and he gained ownership over time. In situations where he is only owning 5 or 10% of the company, then he's usually advocating for change, but almost a little bit from an outside perspective. But he already had overcome us in the sense of he'd gained ownership, so he could effectively control the direction of the company.
Interesting. So in cases where he's coming in as a 5% owner and influencing change through activism, it looks a little different than, I think, what does he have, 83%?
He owns 83% of our parent company, and it is different because you're negotiating from the outside in an activist context. His track record has been very successful there, so they tend to listen to him. Here, he counts on the management team, and they support him. With all the owners that I've dealt with, you develop the business plan, you present it, and you make the case for where we should be going. It's not any different with the Icahn organization than it was with the other organizations that I've been with. Again, the intensity levels maybe a degree or two higher than before, but the idea and the focus is the same. We acquired a company last summer, and we gathered their support because we needed their support to be able to get that done. That effectively doubles the size of our fertilizer group, and that was an idea that after they understood what we were trying to do, they backed us on that. But you have to be prepared for a high degree of scrutiny on opportunities like that. I find it to be very challenging but interesting. Your ability to think through and develop a good plan, you can sell that. They are all about success and building a business and making money. Our interests are always aligned that way.
Let's take a short break, and we'll be right back with Mark Pytosh, CEO of CVR Partners. What's changed in you in coming to CEO in terms of the people? What have you done differently?
One of the things that I've noticed right away is the difference between the CFO and the CEO is that the employees ultimately look to the CEO to set the direction for the company, to explain where are we going, what are we doing, why are we doing that. When I was a CFO, I always thought that I was very involved in the decision making and how we got to our plan, either on growing the business or an annual budget or something like that. The CFO helps get it done, but it's really the CEO who's setting the path for where the business is going. That expectation's different, and that's something that you just don't know until you get into the position where you realize the employees are really looking to you to lead them, to guide them.
So what have you done in that respect in answering that call of the CEO?
you're focused more on communication than you were before. So communicating with the key leaders in the company and talking to them, and the overall communication and how you're leading is different than what the CFO would do. So you're not a peer anymore. You're the person that they're looking at to say, where are we headed? What are we doing? And what are we going to do this year? What are we going to do for the next 5 years? And how you communicate it and how confident you are and how you say things, very important. But you're setting the tone, and that's very different than what I did. And ultimately, there's some tough decisions that get made. And, as a CFO, you were always providing your thoughts and guidance. The CEO's making that decision. This was one of the things I learned about being a banker. It's a lot easier to tell a company what to do than doing it yourself. And I felt the same way, as a CFO. It's a lot easier to tell the CEO what you think he should do, he or she. It's a lot harder when you're doing it. You're like, okay, now I have to decide. And I'm going to have to live with it, good or bad. I live with it. And that's very different than when you're just providing your advice. Because the person making the decision, they live with the outcome. You have to learn to make a decision and live with your decision. It may be wrong. And quite frankly, your body language and the way you communicate is really important. We're in a very cyclical business. How you behave when in tougher market conditions it's very easy to be optimistic when times are great. And it's harder to sort of steer everything through when times are bad.
Did you do anything special in becoming CEO to hone certain skills or prepare yourself differently?
I think the reason I was prepared for taking the role was I took experiences and exposure to a bunch of CEOs, either as a banker or working as CFO. How do you talk to the board?
Yeah.
How do you talk to Wall Street, the analyst? How do you talk to the banks? I've sort of took pieces of what I thought was effective along the way and what I'd learned and tried to apply that inside the company. I think the most important part of it is their presence, is to be there, is to spend the time with people in the business. In a plant type business or field type business, those people, if you're not genuinely interested, they know. If you don't care, they know you don't care or you're not interested. And but those are the people that make the business work. And I think one of the things that you have to do is you really have to invest the time to sit with folks and understand what they're doing, what the issues are, what's working well, what's not working well. And you don't always like what you hear, but it's how you learn things that need to change in the company. But you really have to invest the time to be there. You can't just sit in the corporate office and understand how business works. I meet with customers a lot. Meeting with customers is really important too. Again, sometimes you hear things you like, sometimes you hear things you don't like. All of that's really important. As CFO, you don't have to do that. As CEO, if you're going to really know what's going on in your company, you have to do that. So it's a very different routine, and I would say it took a little bit to get used to the routine. I was not doing things the same way that I used to. It was much more involvement with the field of business and the operations, a lot of other issues that spin out of human resources, government relations, the finance group. So but very different cadence than.
And how did you create that cadence or maybe that change to focus on that? Because we have our habits, it's tough to break those, and there's an easy thing to go to and focus on, and that may be financial matters. How did you move yourself?
I had to break that habit. I had to, I think that I'm not the CFO anymore. Depending on where you came from in a company, you would say the same thing. You have someone in that role or someone operationally in that role. And if you're going to run the business properly, you have to let go of the day-to-day. One of my issue that I had to let go of is I'm not the CFO. I'm not supposed to weigh in on those issues, and those habits take a little adjusting.
What did you do actively to provide space for your CFO?
I ultimately use my ears. And I listen, we have a strong CFO. She's CFO of all of our 3 companies. I did listen to her when she said, "I'm taking care of that." And over time, I began to understand what that means, that she's taking care of that. Mm-hmm. So and it didn't take me long, but it took a little bit to understand what are the key issues that I'm going to see every day, every week, what's the cadence, and once I understood what's really important for what I'm doing, I don't have time, nor should I be focused in those areas in finance that I used to. That's not helping the company. And so I would say that was probably about a 6-month true transition where it just, over time, it completely dissipated. And today I'm really not involved in any detail there. There's just so many other that are newer areas for me, but areas that are very interesting that I think have more impact than what I used to do.
What are some of the key areas?
I've always liked the strategic side. I grew up doing that. Mm-hmm. And so our industry is under significant transformation in North America. And so that you spend a lot more time working on how do we really win here. There's always a lot of elements going on either in the business itself or in the market. And so there's always a lot to think about. 10 years ago, I don't think I was really ready. I would not have been ready for what I'm doing today. I didn't have enough breadth of experience to do that. But I think the timing worked out really well for my experiences where I was prepared to take on a different role, like what this role is.
Reflecting on that, Mark, and about your readiness, your development, and taking that maybe into advice for boards that are thinking about the CFO in the context of CEO succession. What would be your advice to boards that would consider promoting an internal CFO to CEO?
What's interesting is if you examined the criteria that the board uses to seek a CEO, mm-hmm. for a new CEO in a capital-intensive industry, capital allocation sometimes doesn't make the top 10. How could it not make the top 10? If you were in the power business, oil and gas business, manufacturing, how could capital allocation not be in the top 3? And yet, if you look at the sort of the white papers and the studies that are done for boards for CEO searches in capital-intensive industries, many times capital allocation would be in the back end of a top 10. You would underweight somebody with a financial background in a search like that, even though when you get to the job, that's a critical part of the decisions that you're going to make, because that's one of the big levers that as a CEO you control. And it ties to the strategy, the overall strategy of the company, but what is your strategy? Where are you going to allocate capital, either internally or for acquisitions, mm-hmm. Or for growth projects. And in a capital-intensive industry, you really have to understand your balance sheet and cash flow and the big decisions, because usually the amount of capital that you have available and how you allocate it is a critical part of the decisions you're going to make for the company. And so, yet, having said all that, in the search process, that's not always weighted as highly as you would expect it to be. CFOs tend to fall in a few general buckets. There are CFOs that have and work on a lot of strategic and balance sheet, capital markets activities. That's one group of CFOs. There's another group that are really operationally or cost-focused, capital-focused. And that's another group. And then the third group is really financial reporting, controls, governance. Ultimately, if you're going to get the right experiences to have the chance to become a CEO, I think you need to have enough experiences in the first two categories before if you're just a financial reporting controls person, you probably don't have an understanding about the other issues that are critical, right, for the company. And so I have not seen a lot of CFOs that came out of that have that strong background. You need that, but is that person really qualified? Do they have the experiences to be able to deal with the other issues that the CEO job is going to entail. The other side of that is if you're a strategic person or capital markets oriented, that's your background. If you don't get exposure and you don't spend the time on the operating side, understanding performance, how the business performs, how the business makes money, and the cost side, without that, I think it's difficult unless the company is going through a significant strategic change. CFOs that have some combination of the strategic side in capital markets and have demonstrated that they've been involved on the operating side have the best qualifications to do that, but one or the other. Same way, if you're really operationally cost-focused, do you know enough about the strategic elements or the balance sheet to bring that to bear? So that I think that filters down the CFO universe.
That completes part one of our two-part series with Mark Pytosh. Coming up in the conclusion, we'll explore Mark's own specifics on development as a CEO and his view of the importance for CFOs that aspire to CEO to get coaching, feedback, and support from the current CEO. Critical point. Look for a conclusion to the interview in the coming days, or perhaps it's there right now. And before you get swept away with your everyday activities, please take a moment and go to the iTunes podcast section and subscribe to the Leadership Lyceum. It's free, and it will enable future content to come to you automatically, so you won't miss an episode. Please rate us, spread the word among your fellow executives and board colleagues, and enjoy the latest conversation with your next virtual mentor. The Leadership Lyceum, a CEO's virtual mentor, has been a production of Dinosaur Productions, LLC. Copyright 2016, all rights reserved. Come back and listen. It's lonely at the top.